Welcome back to our study on the book of Romans. This is the Romans Education Part 7, and this is Session 30. This is the part where we're going to be looking at the manifold wisdom of God. At least a part of it, the manifold wisdom of God. Look, I know this group does, but I need to say it, so we'll have it on the tape. There is a core issue here that has to be in your thinking behind everything that we're looking at. When Satan first rebelled, God certainly had the power to immediately take him, create a lake of fire, and put him in it. He did not. Because he did not, it must be because he chose not to. Because there was nothing from keeping him from doing so. So if he chose not to, there has to be purpose behind that. Here is the purpose. God is demonstrating in view of all creation that He alone is the only wise God and the rightful possessor of heaven and earth. And He gets that not because He is omnipotent and He can beat everybody else up, but because He is the only one who is truly qualified to be possessor of heaven and earth. And He is demonstrate, and in order to do that, Satan has to be able to demonstrate what he would do. God, in turn, will demonstrate what He will do. And God is going to say, it's not that I'm going to keep you from having a chance. I'm going to prove, because listen, once this is proved to all creation, there will never again be a doubt about it. At the end, not even Satan will doubt who the rightful possessor of heaven and earth is. This is God proving this. This is not going to allow anyone to go, well, God just forces everybody to do the things He wants. This is not about that. So that's behind all of this that we're looking at. That's why, did God know Satan was going to produce a night? Did He know? Of course He did. But Satan is going to have to play by the rules, so to speak. And I was having an interesting conversation with Karen about that because she was asking me a question about the similarity between what's going on out here and what happened back here at the world of the ungodly when God wiped out the world with the flood, where there all the unbelievers are taken away at once. I'm going to say it to you like I said it to her, because this could wind up to a whole couple of sessions. What Satan did prior to the flood, the methodology that he was using back there, look, he had two things going. He was filling the earth with violence. You remember that? But here's the second thing he did. When the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, those giants who were men of renown, when Satan did that, he broke the rules. And that allowed God to come along and completely wipe out what Satan had done at the judgment of the flood, and that didn't count as his day of wrath. Satan actually broke the rules, and then God wiped all of that out and started over. But by breaking the rules, he came close, didn't he? It was like he cheated. Well, there's more to that story, but we don't have time to talk about that. But I want to point that out. Okay, so I did that. Okay, that segued perfectly. I didn't know how that was going to work.
In comparison to why the dispensation of grace came in right now.
Right.
Similar to
Right. There was a reset back here, and the dispensation of grace, in a sense, is a reset, which we're about to see. Okay, so when God, and look, I want to deal with this too, because if you say, well, I keep saying things like this, not only did Satan earn the right to bring in the remaining portion of his night, But God earned the right to bring in the dispensation of grace. Now, you may take umbrage with that terminology and say, He's God. He doesn't need to earn the right. If He plays by the rules, He does. He can't just willy-nilly do it and that be that. In other words, this thing is, I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but this has to be fair. That would be what? That would be omnipotent God. Let me give you an example. He can't come along and just say, I'm just forgiving everybody's sins. Something has to happen in order for that to take place. What has to happen?
The cross.
Yeah, the cross. Someone has to pay for those.
The Lamb of God, the Redeemer.
Exactly. That Redeemer mandate gets met. Jesus sheds His blood. He pays the price for the sins of the world on the cross. Does God now have a basis on which to forgive sin? Yes. See, that's what I'm saying. God's not just doing stuff. He is providing a basis for which He will do something else, which will provide a basis to do something else, which will eventually result in Him repossessing the world back to Himself. And when He repossesses the world, folks, it won't be that we get out here in the kingdom and He's going to snap His fingers and suddenly the world belongs to Him. This is a process of removing the covering and the veil so that in the kingdom people can now see the light of the truth and the word of the Lord going forth from Jerusalem and Israel being that great nation wherein the Gentile nations see those laws and statutes, those statutes and judgments, and they say there's no God like Israel's God, and the Gentile nations go, and there's no people like this nation who is so wise and understanding. And that begins to affect them. And those nations now, through the kingdom, are going to choose whether or not they are going to follow the Lord. And if they choose Him, and what will happen is the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdom of Christ. They're going to choose that. It's not God going, bink, Satan's in the lake of fire, I now possess the world. It's not a statement, it's a reality. That the world is actually now going to do that. They're going to turn to that. You see what I'm saying? There's no magic here. It's not just God making a declaration and there it is, and by my power, it all happened. Okay, so there's a process that takes place. All right, so here's what I need to show you. By the way, the other thing I need to call to your attention, that I called it first, remember, if you get a point of no return and all of that, here's what happened. When the zenith of ungodliness was reached out here, where God interrupted the program, when they fulfilled Psalm 2, the kings of the earth and the rulers have taken counsel together against the Lord and against His Christ. Not only did that qualify Satan to have his finest hour, but it put the world in a very particular position. That when they totally rejected all three members of the Godhead, it was a point of no return. It made them irreversibly and irrevocably and permanently at odds with God. And there was nothing that could be done in the world at that point that would change that position that the whole world with Israel in its midst, there's nothing that would change the position of the world in the eyes of God. That's what was happening. And when they became that, at the end of the extension of mercy with the stoning of Stephen, and at that stoning, that finally brought it to that far-spent extent where everything that had brought the world, because the world needed to be in that condition out here. And once it actually came into that position, God immediately cut that off. The fall of Israel, the interruption of their program, and the bringing in of the dispensation of grace. And here's why. Romans 11:15. For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? I pulled one verse out because of a word that I want you to look at. It is the word reconcile. I want us to understand what God is doing by reconciling the world. And to do that, let me give you one more verse to look at. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 19. To wit, that God was in Christ reconciling the world unto Himself, not imputing their trespasses unto them, and hath committed unto us the word of reconciliation. Now, here's what's happening. The world gets itself in such a position that it now is irreversibly at odds with God. Which means now, God has no recourse but to do what? Judge the world in His wrath. But God waits until that point, because here's what He is doing right here. When He interrupts that program with Israel, He puts the world into a different position based on something He did through His Son. He was in Christ reconciling the world unto Himself. There is something that God did back here at the cross that allowed for this time, the dispensation of grace, to take place. Actually, it's more than that. But this is what I'm going to tell. This is why I'm going to tell it to you today, and I'm going to show you the details of this next time. But just to see this full picture, is that the world is coming along and it's rejected the Father, it's rejected the Son, and now it's rejected the testimony of the Spirit concerning the Son. That qualifies Satan now to bring in that remaining portion of his night. But before he can do that, God says, hold it. I know you have earned the right to do that. But before you do what you're going to do, now where did Satan finish earning the right? Right here at the end of the extension of mercy. But before that, God earned the right through something that was done on the cross. He earned the right to change the position or the standing of the world before Him. What does it mean if you get reconciled to someone? What does that mean? It means you were at odds and now you're no longer at odds. Now, watch carefully. It does not say, to wit, that God was in Christ saving the world. When He says He is reconciling the world unto Himself, not imputing their trespasses unto them. Let me ask you a question. You know what God is going to do in the day of wrath? He is going to judge the world for what they have done. But when He brings in a dispensation of grace, suspends His program with Israel, and breaks down that middle wall of partition, He now deals with Jew and Gentile on the same level. And now what He does is He is giving every individual an opportunity to be reconciled to Him. It's not that they'll all say yes. It's that everyone now, instead of Him looking at them and saying, you are my permanent enemy forever, because of what He did here, because because the world had reached a point that if there were no dispensation of grace, there would have been nothing left for it but the wrath and judgment of God as an enemy. We read all those verses weeks and weeks ago about, I hate them. My soul abhors them. We read that. And now, instead of being in that position, he says this thing that's going on in the world, blows the whistle, time out. Now I'm going to put the world in a whole different position under grace, and I'm going to give them all an opportunity to be reconciled to me, whether they're Jew or Gentile. It doesn't make any difference. And they're going to be able to respond to something my Son did back here on the cross. And by the way, God doesn't just get to do this. He provided for this back here. But you know what? He never talked about it back in what He was doing with this. He never talked about it back here in the prophets. And He didn't talk about it during His earthly ministry. And He didn't talk about it during the extension of mercy. And as a matter of fact, even after the cross, He never talked about it until He revealed it to the Apostle Paul. That's the first time He talked about something that was done through His Son on the cross that was kept secret. That's the thing that if Satan had known what God... Because what does he need? He needs the world to come to this permanent enemy status. Why? So he can hold on to the world. That's what he's after. He needs a permanent enemy status. He achieved it. Now he's thinking, aha! I got the world in an irreversible position of being at odds with God. It's not going to change. And God says, wait a minute, time out. Before you bring in this last thing you're going to do, before you earn the right, I earn the right. To suspend what was happening in this world and bring in a dispensation of grace in which I am offering men the opportunity to be reconciled to me. Do you understand? I'm not doing this justice. Do you you probably understand that part, but do you understand what God did when He did this? That the world was on an irreversible collision course, and God suspends that thing, and now for 2,000 years, men have they have responded to the word of reconciliation, and they have trusted the gospel. And once they do that, they're no longer enemies of God. They're sons. That wasn't... Look, that's not the way the world was going. Especially the Gentile world. Yes, there was a believing remnant. Well, I need to show you some things. So let's go through the verses here, now that I've kind of talked about that. But, by the way, let me back up one. For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, the casting away of Israel? In other words, in order to give the world an opportunity to be reconciled, God had to have His people fall. That program had to be interrupted. Because if it wasn't, what was on the table wasn't reconciliation. It was imputing their trespasses unto them. Do you remember the 2 Corinthians verse? Let me just show it to you. Reconciling the world to Himself, not imputing. Is God imputing the trespasses of the world to it today? No. Remember back in Romans 11? This is the goodness and forbearance of God. Not His judgment. This is God imputing their trespasses unto them. This is the opportunity to be reconciled. And the amazing thing is, when the world... Look, we don't think of it this way. We don't think of the world got in such a predicament that God decided, you know what, as long as things are going here, You have reached a point, just like we talked about, you have reached a point of no return. And now there's absolutely nothing you can do to stave this off. It's going to happen. But before he does that, he says, and by the way, there's something I had in my mind back at the foundation of the world that I provided for in the death of my son, and I am choosing this to be the time when I interrupt not only my program with Israel, but I suspend Satan bringing to its ultimate goal, his night, and I am offering the world a chance to be reconciled to me. And nobody saw that coming. Satan never saw that coming.
He didn't see it, but what could he do to change it anyway?
He would, if he had seen it, it says they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. If he had known that, he would have gone, see, he thought, he won't do the temptations in the wilderness, he won't succumb to the pressure, he won't play ball, I'll kill him. That's what he thought he was doing. But if he had known this, he would have gone, I'm not killing him. No. I'm not going to be this. We're not, I can't do what I'm going to do. Okay, I'm going to say it to you this way. Satan cannot bring about his finest hour in a reconciled world. He can't. And that's why, and I'm going to show this to you. I know I'm just telling it to you now. But that's why everybody that's ever stood up and taught that we're in the tribulation, everyone that's ever looked around and said that so-and-so is the Antichrist. Look down through history. Hitler was the Antichrist. Mussolini was the Antichrist. Churchill was the Antichrist. Kennedy was the Antichrist. I mean, you can just name them all. All these people that were all looked at as though they were Antichrist. I remember listening to a guy in Dallas who said that, who's the little guy that was always tied his turban in a funny way in the front? Yasser Arafat. Remember Yasser Arafat? That he claimed God told him Yasser Arafat was the Antichrist. He said, the Spirit revealed that to me. Yasser Arafat's the Antichrist, and he's bringing in the tribulation. All you people that believe that there's a rapture, you're crazy. All you did was take a lie that was invented by the Catholic Church to keep the world from knowing that the Pope was the Antichrist. He said, you people didn't get that out of your Bible. He said, the Antichrist is here. It's Yasser Arafat. And he tied his turban in a little funny thing up front. I don't know if you remember the pictures of him. And he said, and that's why Daniel called him the little horn, because it looked like a horn in the front of his turban. Well, here's what God knows. Satan can't produce his finest hour in a reconciled world. What has to happen is God has to bring the dispensation of grace to an end. And when He does, the world will immediately revert right back to its previous standing. And how will it do that? Watch carefully. We have believed the gospel, yes? We have been reconciled unto God. That's an accomplished fact. Well, if Satan can't work that thing in a reconciled world, then in order for the world to return to that place, you have to yank every reconciled believer out of it. No, not in a reconcile. See, it's a different standing. You're now, the world is in a different standing. Before, it earned this place of God's forever enemy. And God went, time out. I earned the right, I purchased, actually, through the blood of my Son, I purchased the right to do this. And so I'm going to do mine first. And as long as I'm doing it, Satan cannot. As long as reconciling is going on, then guess what? The world is not in that standing any longer. And as long as they're in that standing, he cannot bring to pass his finest hour. Now tie that in with what I've told you before. He still has his works of darkness. It's still a night status. But what he has to do is keep those works of darkness at a fever pitch, because whenever this dispensation of grace comes to a close, he's going to bump right into an immediate repositioning of the world as an enemy, and he's got to have everything working to bring about this final aspect of his night. And we're impacting that when we cast off his works of darkness. And now I want to show you. I want to show you the reality of this in the Scripture. 2 Corinthians 5. Now let me back you up here to verse 14. For the love of Christ constraineth us, because we thus judge that if one died, then we're all dead. Now watch this carefully. He's not talking about before you're saved, you're dead in your sins, and after you're saved, now you're alive unto God. That's not what he's talking about here. He doesn't say that Christ died because all are dead in sins. We're all born dead in sins, aren't we? He says all were dead. Paul in Corinthians is talking about the condition of the world back here. And Christ died to remedy that condition. All were dead. Now what's dead? Dead is, there's a lot of ways to talk about dead, and I'm going to sum it up this way. Death is a separation. When your soul leaves your body will be dead when your soul and spirit leave. When you're dead, what's the remarkable thing about what happens to your body? If I died of a heart attack right here, what would happen to my body? I mean, it's standing right here with the hand on the pulpit, and I die of a heart attack just like that. What happens to this body? It just goes to the floor, right? Is it going to get up and do anything? So that is going to result in an inactivity, because my soul and spirit have now left my body. By the way, we're going to see Bible verses next week that talk about this issue, about his spirit left him. And when it did, guess what? He was D-E-A-D, dead. And now I worked for an ambulance service when I was in college. We resuscitated people with CPR every now and then. But for the most part, when we came upon a scene and somebody was dead, they remained in that dead position. And when you're dead, guess what? That condition is permanent. I mean, as far as what this body is doing, that's a permanent, I'm going to use the same words. It is a permanent, irreversible condition. And that's what Paul is talking about here. The world was in a permanent, irreversible, dead, separated from God position. All were dead. That's the way he's looking at the world at large. Yes, there's a few members of Israel that constitute the believing remnant, but they're not the rule. They are the vast exception when you're looking at the world, which is what God is looking at, by the way. Remember John 3:16? For God so loved the world. Did he just pay for the sins of Israel? No, he paid for the sins of the world. Yes, it would be through Israel that salvation would come to the Gentiles, but he was going to have to make a provision for the world. He did that. Okay, but let me take you to these other verses here, because this new legal position that God has put the world into allows Him to do something now, right now, here today, that previously could not have been done, because the world passed the point of no return. Do you understand the uniqueness of what God's doing today? See, this is more than it's just we're not part of the Israel program. That's true, but that's not it. The world in its history, in the increasing darkness of Satan's night, crossed the line of no going back, of being permanently at odds with God, deserving of His wrath, what were vessels of wrath fitted to destruction. And God interrupts that program, and now He is offering the word of reconciliation. And Satan's looking at that and saying, he can't cry foul, because God purchased the right to do it. This is not just about bringing in someone other than Israel. This is about putting the world in a whole different standing before. I know I keep saying it that way. But as soon as the rapture takes place, and every reconciled person is gone, the only people left in the world are of what nature? They're lost. So two things are happening at the rapture. Every reconciled person is gone. The second thing is, God stops the new standing and puts them back in their original standing. And do you know how easy it's going to be to do that? Just like that. Listen to me carefully. Stop thinking. I hear this all the time. I haven't heard it from you, so I'm not talking about you. But I hear this all the time. People say, I'm looking at all the things that are happening over there in the Middle East, and I'm looking at all the things that are happening in the world, and you know what? Surely, this is all setting up for us to be raptured out and to go into the tribulation. Listen to this carefully. God doesn't need one single historical event to take place in order to restart His program with Israel. He doesn't need Egypt to be at odds with Israel. He doesn't need ISIS to be running across Iraq and Syria. He doesn't need the European Union. He doesn't need the euro to bottom out. He doesn't need the Muslims to worship Allah. He doesn't need any of that to restart His program with Israel. And next week I'm going to show you the verses where Paul talks about it's not only a very easy thing for God to do, it's a very natural thing. As soon as He takes the world out of this position, it's in the old position. It's no longer there. It's like, this is a crummy illustration. I hate thinking of these things while I'm preaching because they're never good. But here they are. It's, you know what? It's like the timer. Let's put a timer on something. The time is running. But when the timer goes off, it's ended. It's ended. Look, okay. As if it never was. As far as the condition of the world at that time, it is as though this, in that sense, it's as though this didn't take place. It goes right back to where it was. And listen, it's going to go exactly back to where it was. Exactly back. And God doesn't need anything. It just bothers me for someone to say, look, you know what, a guy is going to stand up this week somewhere in a prophecy conference and wave a newspaper about things that are going on in the Middle East and talk about we're living in the last days. Here's the thing. We don't know, and neither does Satan, if this dispensation of grace is going to run for 10 more days or 2,000 more years. You say, but Brother Mike, things are so bad. Do you know how long people have been saying that? They've been saying that for 2,000 years. If you're Timothy and you're with Paul and you watched all of Asia turn against him, wouldn't you be saying, it looks like the end? It's been a great run, but it looks like it's over. How many times are people going to come to this? Let me take you back to Y2K. Do you remember the panic over that? We all better draw our money out of the bank because when the computers click over to 2000, all of that's going to get wiped out because they didn't put anything in there to click the computers over, and oh my goodness, it's going to be mass confusion, dogs and cats living together. I mean, it's to take the Bill Murray line out of Ghostbusters. I don't know why that popped into my head, but my point is, we've seen these things come and go, come and go. We don't know how long it's going to go. Is it all going to be gone in a few years? Maybe. Will it outlive me? Maybe. I was going to do it like this. Here we are in the dispensation of grace. All you need to do is stand up in most evangelical churches and say, here's the timeline of when the dispensation of grace started, and here's the rapture. And let's say, here we are. Do you know how many people would freak out over putting the X at that point in the timeline? Oh! You think that's where we are? I have no idea where we are. It could be that we're on this side of the X. God has a purpose in reconciling the world that will fit into what He's going to do in the heavenly places, and this thing is going to run according to His good pleasure. And there's no signs, Karen.
Is it possible with the cycles, the way they're going from good to bad to good to bad, is it not Satan's little ploy
Okay.
to
No, go keep talking.
It's not Satan's little ploy to say, eventually to give him the common folk that there is no God?
To say that last line?
There is no God. If it just keeps cycling and cycling and cycling.
Well, you know what? Here's how it works. Here's how it works. That's really good. Here's how it works. You start off with a generation that has faith and form. And I know you're wondering what are you talking about? Let me just put them up here, and I'll show. Oh, all right, I'll talk about it. Faith and form. You have a faith. In other words, it's based on some things that you understand about God and what He considers to be righteous. And what follows out of that is a form. What is the form? Is it okay to go into a hardware store and steal a tool? Why? It doesn't belong to you. But just because it doesn't belong to you, why can't you take it? What makes it wrong? Why do we classify what's right and what's wrong? Where does that come from? That's the form that stems from our faith. In other words, what God has taught us about what is right and what is wrong. The next generation comes along, and they don't like the faith part, but they realize the value of the form. So you know what they do? They X out the faith, and they just keep the form. Because they realize there is value to not having someone kill you, or just run through red lights like they're green lights, or steal your money. In other words, they understand this has value, the form has value, but we don't like the faith, so they eliminate it. The third generation comes along and realizes that form without the faith is empty. It's subjective. It's just a matter of opinion. And what if someone has a different opinion? By the way, people do have different opinions. So you know what they have a choice to make. They either reject the form and the faith because they say, you know what, the form really doesn't have any substance without the faith. We don't like the faith, so we're going to reject it. Or they're going to return to the faith. And when those return to the faith, then they'll have the faith and the form. And then the next generation will come along and say, well, we see the benefits of the form, but we don't like the faith. And then the generation after that comes along and says, your form is worthless. Look, I grew up in the 60s. That was the hippie generation, right? And you remember what the cry was? By the way, I never did get into that. I was too close to my parents to do that. I just didn't have any appeal for me. It just didn't. It just didn't. Huh? Down with the man. And you know what? They hated the status quo. They wanted to tear down the establishment. Now, I remember a guy asking, I remember there was a guy in school I knew was kind of like this anti-establishment guy, and I remember we got into a discussion in class about it, and he was going, I just think all the establishment ought to be torn down, you know, and the teacher said, what would you replace it with? And he went, If you don't have anything to replace it with, you know what you have? The pre-flood world of chaos and violence. You want to talk about it's not a perfect system? What do you have to replace it? By the way, good luck with fallen men running it. What did you expect? Perfection? Now, I'm not excusing the wrongs that are done in the world. What I'm trying to show you, what Karen was talking about, is there is a cycle that takes place. All right, now, just to protect myself, I got to time out and call in a dispensation of grace here. Okay. Someone is going to hear me say this, and they're going to understand something else, and they're going to think I'm saying something that I'm not saying. So before I become the subject of another internet debate and conference, let me clarify this. There are three ways that we view time. The first one is chaotic. And that view just has all the points in time happening in a very random manner. And there's nothing that we get from that. In other words, things just happen. There's no cause and effect. We don't learn anything from history, and history doesn't tell us anything about what's coming up next. None of that is related. It's called chaotic. And then there's another view of time which is cyclical. And that says that time is this never-ending cycle that just keeps repeating itself and repeating itself and repeating itself forever. Now, that is better than chaotic because the cyclical course of time does observe a pattern of something at its peak, and then it diminishes, and then it starts over again. When I'm talking about this, I'm not talking about the cyclical standard of time. That is the way people always saw. They talk about the rise and fall of empires, the rise and the fall of the next empire, the rise and the fall. You see? Now, and so the cyclical is better than chaotic because you're recognizing some patterns. But look, there's one more, and that is I may be too low for you to see it on the tape, the linear way of looking at time. And look, this is linear. It's a line that connects 2 points, a beginning and an end. And I don't want to get off into a far-flung discussion of this, but you understand that when Satan came along, he extinguished the light in every area. And so you know what? When you talk about a linear timeline, the Bible tells you something about the beginning of time. What does it say? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And when we get out here to the end of time, you realize there's going to be a new heavens, a new earth, and we go off into the ages to come in eternity. Well, you know what Satan has done is he has extinguished that light. You have a guy over here named Darwin who proposed a theory that did not say God created the heaven and the earth, but that life started with evolving. Out of nothing came something.
I don't know, I always felt like he was talking about the Bible, about what had happened. Man didn't have anything to do with it. It was God that was bringing it on.
Oh,
It's the argument. Yeah.
well, that's theistic evolution. Right, okay. So, what you have is you have Darwin explaining the front. Then you come along, and over here at the end, there was a fellow named Karl Marx. And you know what he said? The end of the world isn't going to be brought about by God. It's going to be brought about by man. So you have nature starting it out and man ending it. Those are the replacements for the truth, for the light of how it starts and how it ends. Now, only reason I'm bringing that up is because when I show you this thing and it returns back, I am not advocating a cyclical timeline.
But Satan might be.
Oh, well, there's no doubt Satan would. As a matter of fact, when the Greeks, who are credited with being the first real historians, Herodotus, credited with being the first historians, they all held to a cyclical timeline. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, if you go back, you have some Egyptian hieroglyphics and things back with the Syrians and stuff like that, where they noted some kings and some battles and things. So they made a record of history. But look, their record of history was not connected in any way. It was chaotic. They just saw the rise of a hero, and that was an event in and of itself, not connected to anything. They saw another king come in. That wasn't connected to anything. It was chaotic. So when you talk about getting away from unconnected dots with no relation to each other, cyclical may be a step in the right direction, but those historians didn't do that. From the beginning, God gave the Hebrew people a linear understanding of time. Okay, I've gotten way off on that, and my clock went off. And so I have some things that I wanted to talk to you about. Okay, I'll just say them to you quickly. We talked about last time about that understanding of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, that you had to know it was to the remnant. You had to understand John's gospel, and you had to know that there was a division that was being made so that those who were wolves in sheep's clothing would be saying things whereby the remnant would be able to identify them clearly. And I think I showed you, didn't I show you the verses over in, I did, I showed you the verses over in 1 John. Now what I want to do is I want to take that same thing and I want to bring it back to something that Paul is going to talk about for us in the dispensation of grace. And Paul is going to write about this in 2 Corinthians in the first 5 chapters. And in those chapters in 2 Corinthians, he is going to come along and talk about some accusations. Why is this important? Because what I'm about to describe to you, and we'll talk about them in more detail later, but remember when we cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light, there is a retaliation made by the adversary. I am now about to tell you the nature of that first retaliation that will come from Satan. Back in Romans 8, we saw those in progression. This is part of those tribulations. You know what I'm talking about when I say that. We had 7 categories of attacks, the mildest to the most severe. This falls within that general category of tribulations. And they're going to come along and they're going to make 3 accusations are going to be made against you just as they were made against Paul and to the Corinthians, to get the Corinthians to distance themselves from Paul. And the first accusation is that, and you remember Paul was teaching things to them like you're learning now, and the Corinthians were not totally ignorant of all. They just had a point where they dropped out. But here's the first thing. The charge against Paul is weak, and his God is weak. And the reason Paul's God is weak is because Paul claims he is, and this is what Paul writes about, because Paul claims he's not delivering us from the sufferings. And that was the accusation. Paul was teaching that, and so his accusers came along and said, Paul is weak, and he's preaching about a God who is weak. Our God is strong. Our God is omnipotent. Paul doesn't deny God is omnipotent. What he denies is that God is intervening by His omnipotence to deliver them from the sufferings. In fact, Paul's going to come along and talk about suffering being a gift. They don't get that. The darkness doesn't allow them to see that light. So they're going to go, Paul is weak, and his God is weak. And here's the second thing. Paul's zeal is offensive. You know what? That Paul is way out of balance, talking about his zeal. He is way out of balance. What Paul is interested in and what Paul thinks and what Paul says, no. People don't want to hear that. That's what they're saying to the Corinthians.
Because it knocks them out of their comfort zone.
People don't want to hear this. You're not going to... Look, let me put it into today's language. I played this game. I know how this is. You don't know what's happening when you play it, but here it is. You want your church to be big. You want your church to be respected. You want your church to be successful, and they got their own way of defining success. Then you know what? There's some subjects you need to steer away from. And there's some things you don't want to talk about. And you know what? And you don't want to offend anybody. So you better find some ways to go through the motions without making anybody angry. Because when you're building that big building and you've got that building note hanging over your head, if you make a significant or the right people angry and they leave and take people with them, then you're going to be stuck with a payment you can't make and you're going to go under. And I have seen preachers change what they were doing. Here's the next thing they do. And I thank God for you people, because this works right into this. You know what we do not do? We do not go out into this city and try to find the who's who of who is in positions of power and bring those into this assembly and give them positions within this church because we think that the same goals they have are the goals we have. And that's what was going on then, and it goes on today. Which means the deacons in most churches are not godly men. They're businessmen who have pull in the city that they live in. They're the chief of police, or they're the mayor, or they're the school board superintendent, or they're just go down the list. And I'm not trying to say our deacons are nobodies. They're godly men. I'd rather have a godly man working as a deacon in this church than the wealthiest man in Monahans or the most powerful political figure in Monahans. Because those guys... Look, I'm over time. Let me just take a minute and just say this to you. You know what the Corinthians did? They went out and they got those guys. Listen carefully. They were, this is what Paul's going to call them, the religious lost. They are very religious, but they're lost. And the church at Corinth brought them in because they all had similar goals. If a mayor's going to be a part of the church, you know what he wants? He wants to be a part of the biggest, best, brightest, most successful church in town, because that speaks to him, right? And that's what the church wants. So they're willing to bring these guys in. Listen to me. That's what Paul was saying to them in Corinthians when he says, be not, he's speaking to the assembly, not to a young man getting married, although I think that principle is true. He says to the assembly, be not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. If your goals for your assembly is the same as their goals, then your goals are wrong. They're not your Father's goals. And Paul, his ministry, you're not going to build this church following Paul? That guy's going to ruin you. You better decide what you want. Do you want a ministry or you want to be Paul's follower? Don't think it didn't happen just like that. That's exactly how it happened. Here's the third thing. They said Paul was this. They're going to say you're this. He was beside himself. You know what that means? He's lost his marbles. He doesn't have good sense. Yeah, he's crazy. They're looking at that. Look, I have a lot to I know it's a 2 Corinthians issue, and we are going to get over there. But I'm going to tell you what, from 1 Corinthians chapter 1 to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, about verse 16, there are 3 absolute attacks from the adversary. I'm talking to you about the second attack, and that attack is broken down into 3 parts. These are going to be the first kinds of attacks we are going to experience as an assembly. We're going to be warned about what they are before they happen. And then Paul is going to tell you exactly what to do in view of them. Because he wants us to weather these attacks. I'm bringing them up, not because I love going over to 2 Corinthians 5, although I do. I bring them up because when we cast off those works of darkness and put on the armor of light, these are the things that are coming our way first. So we're going to have to be educated concerning them. Oh boy, if you only knew how involved this is, how deep this goes. I'm talking about how the Scripture, okay, I see those looks. Give me 45 seconds here. Do you know the basis on which they do this? That Paul is beside himself? Here's the 3 reasons that they give for that. I'll just give them to you. First of all, Paul is talking about God stopped His program with Israel and He brought in a whole different program, and it was a mystery that no one knew about, and God's doing something now that He wasn't doing back then. Are you kidding me? God never did that before. What makes you think He's doing it now? He never did that. Here's the second one. I told you 45 seconds, so I'll just do them. Here's the second one. And I love it because Paul details this. He's beside himself because he's saying God did something that He's never done before. And secondly, if Paul's right, how come nobody else is doing it? How come all the churches aren't teaching this? If you're right, if this is what God is doing, how come everybody's not teaching it? Paul is beside himself. Here's the third one. We can read back over there in the Gospels, and this, what Paul is teaching, is not what Jesus taught. Jesus never taught about a dispensation of grace and an interruption of the program and all of that. Paul is crazy. And you people that are following him are crazy. I'm getting down to the nitty-gritty now of what this attack is about. You know what it's geared to do? It is geared to use these things for these reasons and make you go home and start doubting if this is really true or not. Just sow the seed of doubt. Well, I don't know. I mean, Mike's a nice guy and I think he's sincere, but how do we know he's right? It's not about me being right. It's about this book being right. That's why I keep pointing us back to this book. How many times have I been wrong? Plenty. But you know what I told you? There's not a single kind of attack that you will encounter that this book hasn't taken into account. Nothing is going to take God by surprise. He has allowed for every contingency, and this book is going to fully answer every objection. I told you that way back in Sonship Orientation. And this is supposed to produce the doubt. And you know what the sad thing is? It works. It works. Your only hope is for this word to be effectually working in you so that you identify the darkness of Satan's untruth for what it is. If this isn't working in us, this is why I obsess over this so much. If it's not working in us, then the attack is going to be successful. Okay. We got to do better than this next week, don't we? Okay. All right. I know this was a long one. Thank you for your patient endurance. There's a reward in heaven for this. Okay.
There was a lady who sent a fine by her church for over $1,000 because she failed to
She had failed to what?
tithe.
They fined her?
They fined her $1,000 because she was that far behind.
Okay. Good to know. That is a really good question. And she said, will the dispensation of grace end in apostasy? And I think it will. Paul says, huh? I'm sorry. Yeah, the ones that are left are definitely going to be. Look, you can be a believer, but you know what? It'll be just like being a believer, being a member of the remnant and going back into the temple and acting like the sacrifices are a legit deal. There will be believers in the dispensation of grace. Will there be some that are faithful? I think there will. But will there be a general apostasy? This thing is going to take its toll. I have an issue that I'm dying to talk to you about, but I cannot. I cannot. Maybe in a year we'll talk about it. Maybe in a year. I've kept you long enough. Let's have prayer and we'll be done. Father, thank you for your goodness to us. And in your word, all that it says to us, there are so many things packed in here. So much that needs to be in our thinking. And I pray that it would be so. So that when this thing is working in us the way that it's supposed to, our natural desire will be to cast off these works of darkness. And as we get ready to talk about those and what they are, and identify them and see how we cast them off and what that armor of light, how that's put on by us, Lord, this is very exciting things, and we are grateful to be able to labor with you in your operation against the adversary and his policy of evil today. And we are thankful that in your manifold wisdom, you provided for a time when you allowed the position of the world to be changed, whereby men could be reconciled to you. May we take advantage of this opportunity, because when it is over, so is that. And that is a terrifying thing. Thank you, Lord, for what you're teaching us.